When I returned from the trip, I found my belongings scattered across the lawn, along with a note that read, "Sorry, Mom, my wife's parents are moving in. There's no room for you anymore." So I moved into my secret apartment and sold the house. By the time they found out, I had already. I'm glad you're here. Stick around and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story goes. I never imagined a quiet weekend at my friend's lake cabin would be the moment everything fell apart. When I pulled into my driveway, the house I'd poured for decades into, the first thing I noticed was the lawn. My rose bushes were crushed. The pots of lilies and lavender I'd been tending since my husband died were shattered across the driveway. Right in the center of the mess, my clothes, photo albums, even my husband's old fishing rod were dumped like garbage. My knees buckled, and I had to grab the car door to keep from falling. I kept thinking, this has to be some kind of mistake. They couldn't do this. Then I saw the note taped to the front door, like a slap across the face. "I'm sorry, Mom. My wife's parents are moving in with us. There's no room for you anymore. I hope you understand." My son's handwriting, neat, steady, just like the essays I stayed up late editing for him in high school. Neighbors stood frozen across the street. Mrs. Lanning pressed her gardening gloves to her chest. The Mulligan kids watched from their porch, eyes wide. I could feel them staring, their sympathy and judgment pressing against my skin. I knocked once, lightly, no answer, then I pounded. My heart thudded so hard I thought it might burst through my ribs. The door cracked open. My son peeked out, face blank, almost ashamed. He didn't look me in the eye, shifting awkwardly like a teenager sneaking in after curfew. "Mom, it's better this way," he mumbled. His wife stepped behind him, arms crossed, lips curled. She looked at me like I was some stray animal that needed to be dealt with. "You've had your time here," she said, her voice sharp and clean. "We need the space. My parents deserve comfort in their old age." My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I tried to remember the last time I asked them for anything. A favor, a ride, a night off. I couldn't think of one. I'd cooked for them, nursed their child when he was sick, gave up travel plans so I could babysit after school, and never once asked for anything in return. My son reached out, not to hold me, but to shut the door. I heard the lock click. It echoed in my head, final and cold. I stood in the June heat, sweat slipping down my back, holding that note like it might explain something. All I could think was, they loved the house more than they ever loved me. And right then, I was done. Not broken, not defeated, just done. Being alone is better than being used. I took a breath, wiped the tears from my face, picked up my old suitcase from the pile. One bag, that's all I needed now. As I walked away, I could feel the neighborhood watching, but for the first time in years, I felt something calm and sharp settle inside me. I found a cracked green bench at the edge of Millstone Park, sat down with my suitcase resting beside me, like it was the last solid thing I owned. Birds chirped, sunlight filtered through the trees. Life moved on. Kids ran past. An old man tossed breadcrumbs to pigeons. A young couple argued softly over spilled coffee. And I sat there, unseen. I looked at my hands, still shaking, still stained, with dirt from the photo albums and that old fishing rod. These hands used to be strong. The same hands that planted every hydrangea, that kneaded dough every Sunday so my son could wake to the smell of bread. I thought about those quiet mornings in the garden, before sunrise, holding a cup of black tea while dew soaked my slippers. I could still hear my grandson's small voice in my head. "Grandma, can I help you water the roses today?" I gave them everything. I gave up weekends with friends because my daughter-in-law needed a break. I passed on the retirement cruises because my son's business was falling apart and I thought maybe my savings could keep him above water. I skipped birthdays, missed reunions, stayed home every time because someone had to keep things steady, and now they wouldn't even open the door. I pulled a crumpled tissue from my pocket and dabbed the sweat from my forehead, pretending that's all it was. An older woman walking by gave me a soft, pitying glance, but didn't stop. I couldn't falter. Nobody wants to get caught in someone else's embarrassment. I don't know how long I sat on that park bench after the sun dipped behind the trees. My thoughts drifted like fog, crashing into each other, breaking apart. But somewhere in that blur, the truth began to surface. I started rethinking every conversation I'd ever had with my daughter-in-law. Her sugary voice when company was around, the way she'd say "Mom" just loud enough for people to hear, only to shift once we were alone. It was always some version of you really shouldn't let him have so many sweets or your style's so outdated. We should modernize. And the signs had been there for years. The throwaway lines about downsizing after my son lost a client. The half-jokes at dinner about how cozy it would be if her parents ever moved in. I remembered the way she looked me square in the eye once and said, "You know, when we finally make this house ours, we'll turn your gardening shed into a guest spa." I forced a laugh back then, thought she was just talking big, like always, but now that memory cut deep, and my son, my own boy who used to cling to me after a bad fall, who'd curl up and sleep on my lap with his breath warm on my skin, he'd been drifting away for years. Once she came into the picture, he stopped needing advice and started needing checks. Every thanks, Mom felt thinner, like it was just something he had to say. I believed I was helping. I believed I was holding the family together. But sitting there, running through it all, I saw what had really been happening. They'd been easing me out all along. They didn't want me anymore. They wanted the house. My house. The one where my husband and I cooked steaks every anniversary, on the back patio, where my grandson learned how to ride a bike, where I planted my first rosebush the week we moved in. But my lips curled into something dry and sour. I had really believed loyalty would protect me. I felt a sharp tug in my chest, but it wasn't grief. It was something colder, harder. A decision was beginning to form. A streetlight came on nearby, throwing pale light across the worn lines in my hands. I had earned every one, every mark, every scar. I was the one who held that family up. I was the one awake at midnight when my son had a fever. I was the one who never left. And this was what I got in return. I folded the photo of my grandson and slid it carefully back into my purse. No more pretending. No more excuses for them. I stood, slow and steady, my knees aching, but I didn't care. Every step I took away from that bench felt easier than the last. I didn't know exactly what came next, but I knew one thing: they thought it was over. They thought I was finally out of their way. They had no idea I was just getting started. The next morning I ended up at a little diner tucked behind Chapel Street. The place smelled like burnt coffee and old stories. It felt safe in its way. I sat alone in a corner booth, hands around a chipped mug of tea I hadn't even touched, watching strangers rush past the window, all carrying their own private weight. That's when I heard a voice I hadn't expected. "Meredith." I turned slowly, and there she was. Marla, my old friend from the neighborhood committee. She came in holding a paper bag full of cinnamon rolls, eyes wide with shock, and something else too, maybe pity. "Oh my God, are you okay?" she asked as she slid into the booth without waiting. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Marla reached over and took my hand, gave it a squeeze. That simple gesture, that bit of warmth, nearly cracked something in me. I held it in, just barely. "They kicked you out, didn't they?" she said, lowering her voice. I just stared. She leaned closer, speaking even softer. "I wasn't going to say anything, but I overheard your daughter-in-law, a few weeks back at the farmer's market. She was telling someone they planned to sell the house as soon as you were out." I thought she was kidding. Who does that to family? But she wasn't joking. She was so matter-of-fact, like your future was hers to decide. My stomach tightened. My chest felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Marla's face went from disbelief to hurt to fury. She said they were going to use the money to cover her parents' debts, that finally, they'd be comfortable. She even bragged about how easy it would be because you trusted them so much. I gripped the sides of my mug until my knuckles turned white. Marla held my hand again. "I wanted to tell you sooner. I just didn't know how. I'm sorry." I let out a long, uneven breath. The room felt off-kilter, like the floor wasn't steady anymore. They loved my money more than me. It tasted bitter in my mouth. For a second I saw my son as a little boy, chubby cheeks, scared of the dark, clinging to my hand. I saw him in his cap and gown, squeezing me so tight I could barely breathe. What happened to that boy? I pressed my hand against my chest, trying to calm the storm inside. My whole life I thought love meant giving, that if I gave enough, they'd see my value. But now I know love without respect isn't love, it's just a deal. Marla's eyes filled with tears. "What are you going to do?" she asked. I lifted my chin. My voice came out steady and sure, like it came from some quiet part of me I hadn't heard from in years. "I'm going to get my life back." I stood, smoothed the wrinkles out of my skirt. Something strong rose up inside me, something I thought I'd lost. Marla wiped her eyes. Good. About time. I walked all the way downtown, past closed-up shops, dragging a suitcase that made my shoulders ache. But every step felt solid, like I was walking toward something that mattered. When I got to the Dalemont block, I stopped outside a brick building wedged between a gallery and a flower shop. The sign said Gallery 8. Years back, before I gave everything up for family, I'd worked part-time at a community center helping with art classes. The director liked my work ethic so much she helped me get a small studio apartment through a staff housing program. I kept it all this time, paid the bare minimum, forgot it was even mine until that night when my fingers found the keys deep in my purse. I unlocked the door and stepped in. It smelled like old paint and dried lavender. The windows were dusty, the furniture was bare, a little bed, a tiny kitchenette, a worn chair, but it felt like peace. I dropped the suitcase and walked to the narrow window that overlooked the alley. For the first time that day, I breathed without it hurting. I kicked off my shoes and stretched my feet across the cool floor. In the stillness, I pictured life with no yelling, no walking on eggshells, no bending myself just to keep someone else from falling apart. I closed my eyes and heard my husband's voice. Quiet doesn't mean weak, Meredith, remember that. And that's when the plan started to take shape. It wasn't going to be loud. It wasn't going to be public. I wasn't going to scream. I'd let them think they'd won. Let them believe I was done, broken. While I was at it, I started pulling together every document I could find. Old tax returns, the deed, marriage licenses, anything that proved the house was still legally mine. I dug out my phone and scrolled until I landed on a name I hadn't thought about in years. Warren, my husband's closest friend, a lawyer who'd since retired. I hadn't spoken to him in forever. My thumb hovered over the call button, chest tight. Then I hit it. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy. Meredith, is everything all right? A slow, steady smile crept across my face. Warren, I said, my voice more even than it had been all day. I think I need your help. Can we meet tomorrow? He didn't press, just said, okay. I pushed off the couch and stretched, every joint stiff like it hadn't moved in days. I shuffled over to the kitchenette, filled the kettle, and set it on the old stove. When the burner clicked on, I leaned against the counter, my hands flat on the surface, staring down at the cracked tile. I could hear my husband's voice like it was yesterday, the words he used to repeat during those long talks at the kitchen table. Don't sign away what's yours, not even to family. Love without respect isn't love at all. I used to think he was being overly cautious, maybe even dramatic. I was sure our son would never betray us. I thought blood meant something deeper than money ever could. But as steam curled from the spout that morning, I felt every word settle in. I remembered the day he talked me into putting the house partially in our son's name for tax breaks for the future. He'd been so gentle, so sure. Now, every legal form felt like a noose they'd been tightening around my neck for years. I took my tea and sat at the small table, dragging out a battered old notebook from one of the boxes I'd unpacked. The pages were yellow, the ink faded, but inside were my husband's notes. Reminders about the house, lists of repairs, names of old lawyers. I ran my hand across his handwriting. It felt like he was right there, calm and certain, like he was, telling me I wasn't alone, that I still had power. I knew going up against them would be a fight. They thought I'd cave, that I was soft, that I'd let this go without a word, but they had no idea what I gave up to keep that house, the careers I let slip, the friends I lost touch with, the sleepless nights spent figuring out how to stretch the bills when my husband got sick. That house was my whole life's worth. As I flipped through the notebook, highlighting numbers, circling names, a quiet resolve settled in. My hands didn't shake anymore. The next morning I showed up early at a small cafe downtown, my old brown coat buttoned up tight even though the sun was already warming the sidewalks. It was a quiet spot tucked behind a bookstore, the kind of place you only find if someone tells you about it. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee hugged the air. I picked a seat by the window and ordered a pot of jasmine tea. While I waited, I watched the slow stream of early risers stroll by. People with dogs, reusable shopping bags, easy mornings. Warren came in a few minutes later, same old leather, briefcase in hand, blazer a little rumpled. He looked older, but those eyes hadn't dulled one bit. He spotted me and smiled. Meredith, he said as he slid into the chair across from me. You look different, stronger. I let out a short laugh. surprised by how much it rang true. Maybe I am, I told him. We sat for a while without saying much. The silence between us wasn't heavy, it just was. When the drinks came, I took a slow breath and laid out the stack of papers I'd gathered. I told him everything. How they'd thrown me out, the note taped to the door, my things tossed out like trash. I watched his face go from stunned to quietly furious. They figured you wouldn't fight back, he said, tapping the deed with one finger. But this paperwork's still in your name. The main title, they can't sell a damn thing without your signature. Something stirred in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but it was the first time I felt like I had something solid under me. Warren kept going, calm and clear. We'll file for an injunction, stop any sale attempts cold. Once that's in place, we can move to confirm full ownership. They'll get the notice, and you'll be back in charge. I nodded slowly, letting it sink in. Then he leaned closer, voice tightening. But Meredith, you need to be ready. Once they realize you're not walking away, they're going to push harder. I took a breath. It settled deep in my stomach. Not fear, not anymore. Something colder, firmer. Let them come, I said. They already took what they could. There's nothing left to destroy. We went through every page, one by one, highlighting the key points. As Warren scribbled down notes, I caught my reflection in the window. I hardly recognized her. Lines across the face, silver in the hair, but the eyes looking back didn't flinch. I thought of everything they tried to erase. My garden evenings, warm bread on Sunday mornings, the echo of real laughter in those rooms. They never earned it. When we finished, Warren rested his hand on mine. You're doing the right thing, Meredith. It's time they saw who you really are. I gripped his hand, steadier than I'd felt in years. Walking out of the cafe into the bright morning, I felt a jolt run through me. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was pushing back. That night, in my studio, I was stacking the last of the paperwork when my phone buzzed. My son's name lit up the screen. I froze, thumb just above the green button. Part of me wanted to let it ring, hold onto the silence I'd finally earned. But I answered. Mom, he said fast, his voice tight like he was trying too hard. Where are you? We've been worried. I almost laughed, worried, after tossing me out like a worn-out chair. Now he was pretending to care. I'm fine, I said, voice flat, giving him nothing. He went quiet. I pictured him pacing, running a hand through his hair like he always did when he lied. Look, he said, it got heated. None of us meant for it to go that far. Can we meet? Just talk. The bitterness rose in my throat, but I said yes. I wanted to see his face when it hit him, what he'd given up. We agreed, on a downtown diner, same one where Marla had first told me the truth. I got there early, took a booth by the window. The waitress brought tea, and I watched the steam rise, thinking about all the dinners I used to make for him, the hands I used to hold when he cried. When he finally walked in, he looked worn down, like sleep hadn't touched him in days. His wife followed close behind, eyes sharp, jaw set. They slid into the booth like they were stepping onto a stage. Mommy started, reaching across the table. I pulled my hand back, folding it tight in my lap. He blinked. We wanted to say sorry. He rushed out. It was a misunderstanding. We thought it'd be easier if we... Easier for who? I cut in, voice low but sharp enough to slice. He looked at his wife, lost. She jumped in, quick. We've been under a lot of pressure. You know that. Her tone was sweet, stretched thin and artificial. My parents don't have anywhere else to stay, and we figured, since you've always been the independent one, you wouldn't mind finding another place for a bit. I watched her closely, every word chosen like she was trying to tiptoe across ice without falling through. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. These are the final property transfer papers, she said, smooth as glass. We just thought, if you signed them now, it'd tie everything up clean, and we could move forward like a family again. I stared at the envelope. My fingers itched to rip it in two, but I didn't move. Instead, I gave her a small smile and nudged it back across the table. I'll think about it, I said, keeping my voice steady. She let out a laugh, forced and hollow, her eyes narrowing just a little. Of course. We knew you'd be reasonable. That's when my son really looked at me. For the first time that day, his eyes met mine. And for just a second, something flickered there. Shame, maybe. Or maybe it just hit him that he didn't recognize the woman sitting across from him anymore. I finished my tea slowly and stood up. Before either of them could speak again, As I walked toward the door, I heard her hiss under her breath. What does she mean? She'll think about it. She's supposed to sign today. I pushed open the diner door and stepped out into the cool air, a quiet, satisfying surge rising in my chest. Let them scramble. Let them panic. They thought one last signature could buy me off. But I wasn't theirs to buy. Not anymore. When I got back to my studio that night, I dropped the envelope on the table like it was spoiled meat. I stood there for a long time, just staring at it. Every line was there, plain as day. Legal language, signature boxes, betrayals tucked in the margins, and in that moment, a calm settled over me like I'd stepped out of some long, aching fog. I walked into the kitchen and set water to boil. The kettle whistled sharp, but I moved slow, each motion deliberate, almost ceremonial. I grabbed the old tin of jasmine tea and let the leaves steep, breathing in the soft floral steam. While I waited, I pulled out the photo album I'd pulled off the lawn that day. Page by page, I turned through it, stopping at the photo of my husband out back, grinning with a basket of tomatoes. Another of my grandson on a summer night, sparkler in hand, face lit up with joy. I let my fingers rest on their faces, and for the first time since that day, the hurt didn't rise. What I felt was solid, steady. That's when I understood. I didn't just lose a house. I lost the fantasy of what we were pretending to be. They'd made it clear, in the worst possible way, that love without respect isn't love. It's just a cage with soft lining. I took a slow sip of tea, letting the heat work through me. Then I picked up the phone and called Warren. My voice was calm. "Warren," I said, steady as a stone. "I want to go over the papers again tomorrow. I'm ready to put the house on the market, my way." There was a pause. When he spoke, his voice had that quiet kind of respect. "You're sure yet?" I said it like I'd been saying it my whole life. I've spent years patching other people's cracks, and no one ever looked twice. This is mine. I get to choose how it ends. I hung up and set the phone down gently, like it mattered. Then I picked up a pair of scissors and cut straight through the papers. Each slice was like cutting loose from something I never asked to carry. When I was done, I brushed the scraps into the trash, wiped my hands clean on a dish towel, and sat back down. I took another sip of tea. My fingers trembled a little, not from fear, but from the thrill of finally saying no. In that tiny kitchen, surrounded by old tile and dusty blinds, I felt stronger than I ever had in that big, shiny house full of fake smiles and cold silence. I looked at the album again, tracing my grandson's face with one finger. "They'll miss me," I said into the quiet, but only because I finally walked away. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the city outside, honking cars, distant music, the soft hum of strangers moving through the night. For the first time, in what felt like forever, I wasn't a mom, or a wife, or the one holding everything together. I was just Meredith. Before the sky even turned pale, I was already up, the city still half asleep outside the studio window. I grabbed my purse and the old manila folder with the house documents and headed downtown to see Warren. He met me with a worn-out but sincere smile, waved me in before the sidewalks filled up. We laid everything out on his wide, solid desk, the kind of desk that made you feel like things could actually change. He tapped the folder and said, "We'll move fast. I've got a realtor I trust who can handle this quietly. No one will suspect a thing until it's already done." I nodded, letting that sink all the way in. He didn't waste time. Started dialing numbers, making arrangements. While he worked, I sat in the leather chair near the window, watching early commuters blur past, coffee in hand, heads down. For years I looked at those crowds like I was on the outside looking in, like I was too old or too worn down to be part of that world. But today, I felt like I had more pulse than all of them. When Warren finished, he glanced at me over the rim of his glasses and said, "It's done. The listings live, but kept private for now. They won't see it coming. Offers are going to come quick." That house means more than they ever bothered to understand. I let out a slow breath, and for the first time in days, my shoulders actually dropped. "Thank you," I told him, my voice catching a little. He shook his head with that same steady look. "Don't thank me yet. We're not at the finish line. But Meredith, I'm proud of you." I pressed my lips together, felt heat crawl up my face. When all the papers were tucked away, I stopped at a tiny fabric store on my walk back. I hadn't touched my sewing stash in years, but I wanted the focus, the quiet steadiness of it again. Back at the studio, I pulled out a half-finished quilt I'd started decades ago, laid it out, ran my hands across the worn, familiar patches. Then I threaded a needle and got to work. Each stitch felt clean, sure, like the choices I was finally making. By late afternoon, the room had a new kind of life in it. Threads scattered across the table, an old radio humming something soft, jasmine, rising from my teacup. I knew they'd find out soon, knew the shock would hit hard. They'd yell, accuse, flail around like drowning men, but in that little room, surrounded by fabric, tea, and my own breath, they couldn't touch me. I thought, being alone isn't a punishment. It's a gift, wrapped up in the truth they never meant to show me. I finished a seam, held it up to the last light of the day, and let myself smile, quiet, honest. The week passed slow, but for once, I wasn't racing to fix anyone's mess. Each morning, I woke early, wrapped up in my old robe, brewed tea, and sat by the window with the quilt in my lap, stitching without hurry. It felt like putting parts of myself back where they belonged. A few days later, I walked into Warren's office again, shoulders square, chin high, like it hadn't been in years. He stood up as I walked in, gave me a long look, like he had to take a second to recognize me. "Meredith," he said, a smile creeping in. "You look lighter." I gave a small smile and set my bag down. "That's 'cause I finally let go of the weight," he nodded, motioning for me to sit. We opened up the last stack of papers across his desk. "These," he said, tapping the folder, "are the final sale documents. Once you sign, the house is gone. The money goes straight to you." I paused, let my fingers drift over the edge of the papers. Just for a moment, I saw it all again. My grandson, running barefoot across the kitchen floor, my husband humming while he diced onions, my boy laughing out back when he was still small. But just as quickly, the warmth gave way to the sting of that note they left taped to the door. "Don't cause a scene." I took a long breath and reached for the pen. My hand didn't shake, not even a little, and the signature flowed across the page like it had been waiting there all along. When it was done, I set the pen down carefully, like it mattered. A strange surge ran through me, like I'd jumped off something high, and realized halfway down I wasn't falling. I was flying. Warren stood across from me, watching with that kind of quiet respect that doesn't need words. "It's official," he said. "The house is no longer theirs to touch or claim. You did it, Meredith." I nodded, slow and sure, a flicker of a smile twitching at the edge of my lips. "I didn't do it just for me," I said, my voice low. "I did it for every woman who was told to keep quiet, to give up, to disappear." Warren's face softened as he reached across the table, laying his hand gently on top of mine. "You're free now," he said. Those words echoed in my mind like Sunday bells. 7 days later, the knock came. It was one of those cold, steady rain afternoons that feels like it's pressing down on your skin, and even the boldest people hurry home. But there was no safe place left for them. A court bailiff stood at their front door, rain slipping down his coat, 2 uniformed officers behind him. In his gloved hand, he held the official notice. My son answered first. I could see his face. From the sidewalk, he turned pale, mouth working but no words coming out. A beat later, his wife stepped into view, face twisting in this stunned disbelief like she still hadn't registered what was happening. "Mr. and Mrs. Ashford?" the bailiff asked, his voice calm, polite, like he was checking a name off a guest list. They nodded without saying anything, frozen. The bailiff unfolded the document and read with steady, practiced clarity. "This property has been legally sold. You are hereby required to vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in court-ordered removal." My daughter-in-law let out this sound, half scream, half choke, and grabbed the doorframe like she was trying to hold on to the whole house through it. Behind her, I saw the living room. My living room. The walls where I used to hang my husband's old fishing hat. The fireplace where my grandson burned his first marshmallow, too close to the flame. No sadness came, just a clear, unwavering stillness in my chest. Neighbors started showing up with umbrellas, whispering under the rain. Some had their phones out. Across the street, I spotted Mrs. Lanning staring like she couldn't believe it. My son finally spoke. "This has to be a mistake," he stammered, stepping forward. "My mom would never." The bailiff handed him a thick envelope without blinking. "All documentation is here. Transfer of ownership, sale confirmation, eviction order." You're welcome to review it with legal counsel. His hands shook so hard the envelope nearly slipped into the puddle by his feet. I stayed where I was, just a few feet off, my umbrella resting easy on my shoulder. The rain slid down my face, mingling with a single tear I let fall, not out of grief, but because it felt like something leaving me for good, a last rinse, one final wash of all the years I'd spent folding myself down so others could take up space. My daughter-in-law crumpled onto the steps, crying now, without shame. My son hovered over her, still clinging to the papers like maybe if he held tight enough, this wouldn't be real. The bailiff pinned the eviction notice to the front door and gave a nod. The officers stayed back, silent, their presence firm, carrying out the law I had set into motion. I lingered for a breath longer, taking in the weight of the air, the smell of wet leaves and old brick. Then I turned and walked away. My pace steady, my spine tall. They thought they could bury me under guilt and silence. They thought I'd stay down, but I wasn't buried. I was planted. And now I had finally grown. The next morning, I asked them to meet me at a cafe downtown. It wasn't just any coffee shop. It was the busiest spot on Chapel Street, the kind of place where young professionals pounded out emails over almond milk lattes, and retired couples spent hours trading stories over bottomless cups of drip. I got there early and picked a table dead center, where every face could turn and watch if they wanted to. I wore my best navy coat and clipped on a pearl brooch I hadn't touched since my husband's funeral. When they walked in, they looked pale, haunted, like they were already halfway through some nightmare. My son's eyes were sunken, scanning the room like he wasn't sure where he'd landed. My daughter-in-law clutched her luxury handbag tight to her ribs like she was afraid someone would snatch it. Or maybe like it was the only thing keeping her standing. I motioned to the chairs across from me, still and calm. They sat down without saying a word. The room went so quiet you could hear the espresso machine stall. Even the barista froze, steam wand mid-hiss. I reached into my bag and pulled out a slim envelope, sliding it across the table. These, I said, my voice steady but low, are the final legal papers for the sale of the house. You don't own it anymore. You can't fight it. My son's hands shook as he picked it up. My daughter-in-law broke immediately, tears already slipping down her cheeks, catching on her lip, smearing across her face like her foundation was melting. I just watched them. I didn't blink. Then I reached into my purse again and placed a check on top of the envelope. This is to help you move, I said, my tone even a gesture, nothing more. Enough for a cheap motel, a few nights, food, enough to get somewhere and think. She made this choked, wet sound, covered her face, and her mascara bled through her fingers. My son finally looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. His eyes were wild and red, full of a panic he didn't know what to do with. Mom, he said, hoarse, please, we didn't mean, we thought. I lifted my hand to stop him. No, you made your decisions, I said, voice firm and flat. You loved that house more than you ever loved me. You thought I'd cave. You thought I couldn't stand up to you. You were wrong. The silence around us pressed in like a wall. A woman at the next table paused mid-sip. Frozen. My son reached out for me, and I let him get close, but I drew my hand back before he could touch it. You miss me now because I finally said no, I told him. I met his eyes for the last time, then took my time finishing my tea, slow and deliberate. They sat there, hunched and shaken, their lives collapsing right in front of them. I stood, pulled a few bills from my wallet to pay for my drink, and walked out without turning around. Behind me, her sobbing split through the quiet like sirens, his voice low and broken, trying to pull something back that was already gone. I didn't look back. Outside, the city felt bigger, brighter, like the air itself had opened up. I breathed deep, let the chill sting my lungs. That was it, the last thread cut. I was done. I was free. I didn't head straight home. I kept walking, past bookstores with chalkboard signs out front, flower carts bursting with color, street corners buzzing with people trying to live their lives. My steps felt light, like I was floating just above the sidewalk. When I finally got to Warren's office, he looked up, surprised. Meredith, he said, standing. Everything okay? I nodded and shut the door behind me. I want to make one more change, I said, my voice calm but sharp. I sat down and opened a thick folder, the one with all my financial paperwork. I want everything left, from the house, from the inheritance, redirected, I told him. Put it in a trust for senior support, women's shelters. Something that actually helps real people. People who don't just see me as an ATM. Warren blinked, then slowly smiled like a proud dad who'd just watched his kid do something brave. You sure? He asked, voice soft. I looked at him, clear-eyed. They only ever loved my money, I said. Now they don't get either. He leaned in and got to work, no questions asked. We spent the next hour combing through every line, every clause, with each signature. It felt like I was cutting loose a weight I'd carried for years. When I finally signed the last page, Warren let out a breath like he'd been underwater. It's done, he said. They'll get the official notice tonight. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and for the first time in decades I felt like I could breathe without effort. Thank you, I said, my voice shaking just enough to let something reel through. It wasn't weakness, it was the sound of release. He gave me a quiet nod, his eyes full. You did something remarkable today, Meredith. I left as the sky began turning that soft amber, the first sign of evening settling in. That same night, they got the envelope, hand-delivered to the cheap motel they'd been calling home. Inside was a formal letter, laying it all out. Every penny they thought they'd collect, every comfort they assumed was waiting. It was all gone, reassigned, reclaimed. No cushion, no soft landing. Just the weight of their own decisions pressing down on them at last. I imagined them flipping through the papers, voices climbing, panic creeping in. I saw my son hurling the folder across the room, his wife sinking into the carpet, crying into sleeves that cost more than their rent. The calls started that night. My phone lit up over and over on the kitchen counter, his name flashing like a fire alarm. I didn't pick up. Then came the texts. Mom, please, we need to talk. You can't do this to us. We made mistakes, but we're still your family. I set the phone down without a word and went back to folding the quilt I'd been working on, lining up each edge with care. By dawn, they were at my door. I heard the banging echo through the hallway, followed by muffled voices pressing against the thin studio walls. Mom, please, open the door. We can fix this. You can't just leave us like this. Their voices weren't full of love. They were full of fear. Not the fear of losing me, but of losing their grip on the life they thought they were owed. Of facing a world that didn't care who they were or what they expected. I stood there, in my kitchen, still and calm, not a single step toward the door. I didn't even look at it. Eventually, the knocking turned to pleading. My daughter-in-law's voice cracked under the strain. Please, we'll do anything. We can't live like this. Think of your grandson. A hard laugh caught in my throat, but I didn't let it out. They only remembered me once I said no. Their cries wore down to quiet sobs, and then, finally, to silence. I heard them walk away, footsteps dragging toward whatever borrowed room was left. I pictured their heads down, avoiding the neighbors' eyes, because by then, the neighbors knew. Word moved fast after the eviction. People who used to wave from across the street now whispered behind fences. I caught Mrs. Lanning's voice in the grocery store, loud and clear. After everything she did for them, they tossed her aside like nothing and thought it wouldn't come back on them. Another neighbor chimed in, shaking his head. You treat people like trash. It's gonna catch up with you. The irony wasn't lost on me. After all those years of swallowing my pride, folding myself smaller just to keep the peace, now it was my silence making all the noise. My story wasn't hidden anymore. It was out there, loud and undeniable, stretching down every street they used to feel safe on. They were truly alone now. Later that afternoon, I blocked their numbers, deleted every voicemail before it could start, shut every door they might think to knock on, every crack they might try to slip through. I sat back down with my tea and picked up my quilt again, and something inside me settled for good. I didn't hate them. That would still mean they mattered. They didn't. Not anymore. What I felt was clean, still, and empty in the best way. Better than any fake dinner or strained holiday smile I ever forced my way through. The city outside kept moving, loud and uncaring, and for the first time in a long time, so did I. Over the next few weeks, I shaped my tiny studio into something that felt like it belonged to me. One afternoon, I watered the herbs growing on my window ledge and looked out over the buildings and the street below, and I felt nothing at all for that big house in the suburbs. I started waking up before the sun most days, not out of habit or obligation, just peace. A quiet kind of peace I never knew I was missing until the house emptied out and stayed that way. the kind that didn't rush or demand, didn't whisper someone else's needs before my own. I'd sit up in bed, with the lights still pale and blue through the windows, wrap myself in that old robe with the frayed sleeve, and let the silence hold me. There were no packed lunchboxes to make, no creaky hallway footsteps, no passive-aggressive sighs behind coffee mugs. Just my breath, the kettle on the stove, the thin sound of the city stretching its arms outside my window. I started small. I cleaned the apartment, scrubbed the corners until they shined. Like maybe if I wiped away enough dust, I could see who I used to be. Underneath it all, I found the photo of me and Harold on our wedding day, hidden behind tax folders in the bottom of a box. I pinned it on the wall near the stove, just above where the steam rose when I boiled tea. He'd always said I was most myself when I wasn't trying to be anything for anyone else. I stared at that photo until the words came back to me, soft as breath. Don't sign away what's yours, not even to family. I remembered how I used to paint. Not professionally, nothing dramatic. Just late evenings after the dishes were done and the house was still, I'd sit in the garden with a cheap set of acrylics and a chipped mason jar of water and try to catch the way the sun sank behind the hydrangeas. I hadn't picked up a brush in years, but one day, after coming home from the senior center, stopped by a craft shop on 8th Street, bought a small set, 10 colors, 3 brushes, and a blank canvas no bigger than a dinner plate. That night, I painted the view outside my apartment window. It wasn't beautiful. The alley was cracked, full of trash bins and graffiti. But when I stepped back, I saw light in the corner of the frame. A sliver of morning gold brushing the top of the bricks, and it made the whole thing feel alive. At the senior center, they gave me a name tag, just Meredith. No titles, no mom, no Mrs. Ashford, no grandma. I wore it like armor. I started leading a weekly quilting circle. The first day, 2 women showed up, both in worn-out cardigans and quiet moods. By the 3rd week, we needed more chairs. They called it Meredith's table, even printed a little sign for the door. We stitched everything, scraps from old uniforms, flannel baby clothes, even a piece of a church choir robe one woman had worn for 30 years. It wasn't just sewing, it was reclaiming, thread by thread, what we were told to throw away. Some days I'd walk past the big city park with my tea in a thermos, watching mothers juggle strollers and tantrums. I'd nod at them, quiet inside. I didn't envy them anymore. Not the chaos, not the noise. I felt older, yes, but freer too. My hands weren't worn from wiping messes or dialing my son's number, just to check if he was okay. They were busy building something that asked nothing. In return, the calls from my grandson came once a month, sometimes more, always supervised. Short, polite. I'd hear the hesitation in his voice, like he didn't know what was allowed. But every time, I'd ask him one thing about himself that had nothing to do with their home. Tell me something that made you laugh this week. Or, what's the funniest word you've ever heard? He told me once that he thought the word kumquat was hilarious. It sounds like a squirrel sneezing, he said, giggling until he hit. That kind of laughter, it stitched something back in me. I never mentioned the house. Never asked if they were still scraping by, if they'd found someplace stable. I didn't want to know, not out of cruelty, but clarity. Their struggle was their own now. I had shouldered their storms long enough. That quilt I was stitching every evening, the one with pieces of my husband's shirt, my grandson's baby blanket, a strip from the first apron I ever owned. That quilt wasn't for them. It was for me, for the woman who stayed too long in a house that stopped being hers the moment she made herself small. One morning, I was sweeping up threads at the center when Clarissa pulled me aside. She wore her usual utility vest and wide-rimmed glasses, but her voice was quieter than usual. "We've got an opening," she said. "Part-time staff, paid, teaching arts and crafts to residents. You'd be perfect." I blinked at her. "Me? I'm not. You're already doing it." She cut in. "Might as well let us pay you." I stared at her, broom in hand, heart suddenly loud in my chest. I thought about the years I'd spent giving everything away for free. Love, labor, loyalty. And here she was, offering something in return, for doing what came naturally, what made me feel whole. I said yes. The job came with a badge and a key to a small office space in the back of the center. I moved in my paint set, a portable radio, and a small notebook where I started writing again. Not stories about them, my family. I was done giving them chapters. I wrote about old women who fell in love again, about lonely men who found peace, planting basil on their fire escape. Stories without bitterness, just truth and survival. Some days were harder than others. Grief doesn't follow a clock. Sometimes I'd catch a whiff of lavender and forget where I was, or I'd see a boy around my grandson's age and my hands would tremble. But even then, I knew I was walking forward, not in spite of the hurt, but because of it. Spring came, slow that year. The buds on the city trees stretched lazily toward the sun, like they weren't quite ready to bloom. I knew how that felt. I spent one Sunday cleaning out my closet, packing up things I no longer needed, old scarves, dresses that belonged to a woman who kept saying yes when she meant no. I boxed them with care and dropped them off at a women's shelter near the train station. The woman at the desk smiled as she took them. "These'll go fast," she said. "They're beautiful." "They're done waiting," I replied. That night, I stood by the window, sipping jasmine tea, watching the light spill gold across the kitchen wall. My quilt was finished, folded neat at the edge of my bed. My badge for the senior center hung on the hook by the door. The apartment smelled like lemon and laundry. I wasn't the same woman who sat on that park bench, holding her whole life in one bag. I was someone new now. Someone no longer borrowed by the needs of others. Someone no longer silenced by guilt. Someone finally, fully, her own. I was hanging the quilt in the center hallway of the senior center when the letter came. It wasn't the kind of envelope you ignore. Heavy paper, hand-addressed, no return label. The handwriting was neat and narrow, a little old-fashioned. It reminded me of how Harold used to write grocery lists. Each item spelled out completely, even milk, not M, not a scribble, just milk, the whole thing. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the crease. Inside was a card printed on creamstock, embossed at the top with a small emblem, the crest of Belrose School for the Arts. I stared at it a moment, unsure what to feel. Then, I read the name, signed at the bottom. Rachel Tomlinson. I hadn't heard that name in 30 years. She'd been in my first adult watercolor class at the community center, back when my son was still in middle school and Harold was alive, quiet, kept to herself. Always wore those oversized cardigans and clip-on earrings, like she was trying to blend in. But her paintings, they burst. Color spilled everywhere. Wild, fearless. I used to tell her she didn't need permission to take up space. Apparently, she remembered. The letter was short. She'd gone on to teach, then direct a small regional arts program. Recently accepted a board seat at Belrose. They were launching a new residency program, focused on late-bloom creators. Artists who hadn't had the chance, or the space, to focus on themselves before. She wrote, "Your name was the first that came to mind. You taught me how to be loud with color. It's time someone gave that back to you." The residency came with a stipend, room and board, and a small studio upstate with windows that faced the hills for months. Just me, my work, my time. I sat with that letter for a long while, let it rest on the kitchen table while I folded laundry, while I washed out my mug, while I brushed my teeth and listened to the quiet shuffle of the world outside. And then, just before bed, I ran my finger along the edge of the envelope, held the weight of it in my palm, and said yes. Packing was simple. A suitcase, a box of paints, my brushes, a few books, and the quilt. I left behind most of what I'd gathered in the city, not out of spite, just clarity. The studio apartment had done what it was meant to. It held me through the storm. Now, it was time to step into the calm. Clarissa cried when I told her. She tried to hide it with a joke about who'd fix the crooked chairs or teach the Tuesday group how to sew in straight lines. But I saw it in her eyes. That look women give one another when one of them finally makes it out. "I'll keep your spot," she said, "when you come back." "I might not," I replied softly. And I meant it. The first morning in the hills, I opened every window in the cottage and let the cold air slice through the rooms. I stood barefoot on the wooden floor and breathed until my lungs stung. Then I unpacked the brushes, laid out a canvas, and waited. Nothing came at first. No visions, no flood of purpose. Just the soft creak of the trees outside and the steady beat of my heart. But that was enough. I painted what I saw, the curve of the hill, the frost tracing the windowpane, the deep line of a shadow crawling across the room at dusk. I painted the silence, over and over, until it wasn't empty anymore. I wrote too, late at night, by hand, by lamplight. Nothing fancy, just thoughts, memories that hadn't surfaced in years. The first time I danced barefoot in the rain. The smell of my husband's shirts after a long workday. The day my son was born, when I thought the love I gave him would be enough to last forever. It wasn't bitterness anymore, just truth, set down without apology. The program director stopped by twice a week to check in, bring supplies, drop off mail. On the third visit, he asked if I'd be willing to give a talk to the other residents, maybe even some students at the local college. About what? I asked. About what it means to begin again. I told him I'd think about it. But later that night, staring out at the moon dragging silver across the trees, I said the words aloud. I began again when I let go of who I was told to be, and just like that, I knew exactly what I'd say. The talk was held in a small auditorium, nothing grand, maybe 50 people, most of them younger than my son. They expected a lecture on technique. Instead, I told them about the silence that settles when you stop being someone's convenience. I told them about the park bench, the rose bushes crushed under someone else's comfort, about standing in the rain and not begging to be let back in. I said, we spend too much of our lives holding the door open for people who would never do the same for us. At some point, you have to shut it. Not with anger, just finality. They didn't ask questions. They just sat there, still, listening. One girl cried. I stayed the full 4 months, painted more than I had in 30 years. I sent one letter to my grandson with a photo of a painting I'd done of him and me in the garden, just silhouettes in the evening light, no return address, just a line at the bottom that said, if you want to find me, build your life on truth, I'll be there. No reply ever came, and I didn't expect one. On my last day at the residency, I folded the quilt one final time and packed it in a cedar trunk I'd been given by a fellow artist. I left behind one painting, my very first from the cottage, the alley behind my old apartment, trash bins, rusted pipe, a sliver of gold in the top corner. I titled it Becoming. They hung it in the front gallery with a brass plate beneath. No last name, just Meredith. And as I stepped out into the spring air, bag over my shoulder, wind at my back, I felt no need to rush. Not every story ends in a return. Some end where they finally begin. We're telling this story based on real events. Names and places have been changed to protect the identity of the person involved. It's the story of a mother who sacrificed her entire life for her children and grandchildren, only to be disrespected, used, and abandoned. But when she had nothing left to lose, she rose, and this time, she lived for herself. We don't tell this to judge anyone, but to make you stop and think, how many mothers are suffering in silence inside their own homes? Now, I'm curious about you, the one listening to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever lived through something like this? Tell me in the comments. Meanwhile, I'm leaving you with 2 more stories on the final screen. Favorites on this channel, and ones that will no doubt surprise you. Thank you for staying with me this far.